He arrived at the concert hall early that evening carrying years of discipline in his posture and quiet confidence in his walk. He had grown up believing that music was a language meant for the refined and trained, and he believed that only those who suffered through years of practice truly deserved to touch a grand piano. The hall was old and elegant with carved balconies and soft golden lights that reflected a history of applause and prestige. As he stepped onto the stage for rehearsal, he felt at home because this place matched how he saw himself: serious, respected, and in control. While technicians adjusted chairs and tuned instruments, a woman moved quietly between the rows of seats. She wore a simple cleaning uniform and pushed a small cart filled with cloths and bottles. Most people barely noticed her because she had learned how to move without interrupting others. Her name was never announced, and no one asked where she came from. She had worked there for years, always after hours, always unseen, always careful. As she wiped the edges of the stage, she glanced at the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, polished black with keys that reflected the ceiling lights. Her hands paused for a moment, not out of laziness, but from memory. Long ago, her life had been shaped by a piano very much like this one. Music had once filled her small apartment late at night, when the world felt kinder. Those days were gone, replaced by survival, responsibility, and silence. The pianist noticed her standing too close to the instrument. He did not be unkind, but his voice carried authority when he asked her to step back. She apologized softly and moved away, lowering her eyes to him. She was simply part of the background, someone who kept the place clean so others could shine. He returned to his warm-up, playing light scales with confident speed. As the rehearsal progressed, a few musicians gathered in the hall. Some joked quietly, and others listened half-interested. The pianist played a short, playful tune to loosen the mood. Someone laughed and clapped, and the sound echoed through the empty seats. Feeling pleased, he turned and casually said something about playing something humorous. As if it were easy and effortless, the words were not directed at her, yet they reached her. She felt a small tightening in her chest, not from offense, but from recognition. She knew humor in music not as a trick, but as a feeling. She knew how melodies could smile without asking permission. She continued cleaning, but her hands shook slightly as old confidence stirred with old fear. Her life had not always been like this. She had once studied music seriously under a teacher who believed in discipline more than comfort. She had practiced until her fingers hurt and her neighbors complained. Then life shifted suddenly through illness, loss, and responsibilities. She could not escape. Music became a luxury she could no longer afford, and eventually a memory she kept buried. As the hall grew quieter, she finished her work near the piano again. The pianist stepped away to speak with someone for a moment. The stage was empty and the piano waited. She stood still, knowing she should leave, knowing she should not touch it, but the silence invited her, and her hands remembered what her mind tried to forget. She sat down slowly, as if afraid the bench might vanish. Her fingers hovered above the keys, not trembling now, but steady. She did not play to impress or to be heard. She played because the music had waited long enough. The first notes were soft and warm, filled with gentle humor and lived experience. From the first sound, something changed in the room. The air felt different, fuller, more honest. People turned without understanding why. The pianist froze mid-sentence. As the music reached him, it was not perfect, and it was not showy, but it was real. She did not look up, and she did not stop. Her face showed no pride, only focus and release. Each note carried years of quiet endurance and love for something she never truly left behind. In that moment, she was not a cleaning lady, and not invisible. She was simply someone telling the truth through sound. This was the beginning of a night none of them would forget, and none of them yet understood how deeply it would change their view of talent, dignity, and silence. The sound carried across the hall and settled into the seats like a living thing. People who had been half listening turned fully toward the stage without realizing why. The pianist felt a strange heat rise in his face, not anger but confusion mixed with disbelief. He had spent his life learning control and precision, yet what he heard now felt effortless and honest in a way he could not explain. He walked closer, slowly, careful not to interrupt the flow of the music. The woman continued playing, unaware or perhaps unwilling to look up. Her shoulders relaxed as the melody unfolded, and her breathing matched the rhythm. This was not a performance meant for applause. It was a conversation with memories she thought were lost. A few audience members who had arrived early stood frozen near the aisles. Some held their coats, and others forgot to sit. One older man pressed his hand to his chest, as if something familiar had returned after many years. A young woman near the back smiled, without knowing why. Tears formed in her eyes. The pianist noticed details he had never trained himself to notice: the subtle timing, the natural pauses created by feeling rather than technique, the way humor appeared gently through playful turns instead of forced tricks. It unsettled him, because it challenged the rules he had built his identity on. When the music ended, it did not crash into silence. It softened and faded like a memory closing its eyes. No one moved at first. The woman removed her hands from the keys and sat still, as if waking from a long dream. She stood up quietly, ready to return to her work. That was when the first clap echoed from the balcony, then another and another, until the hall filled with sound. She turned slowly, shock written across her face. The pianist stepped forward, unsure of what to say. For the first time in years, he felt like a student again. He asked her where she had learned to play. His voice carried respect that surprised even him. She answered simply, explaining a past that did not seek sympathy. She spoke of lessons long ago and choices that had closed doors. She did not accuse life or anyone else. She only said music never left her. Even when she had to leave it, something shifted inside the people listening. They no longer saw uniforms or titles. They saw a human story reflected in sound, and the pianist understood that mastery without humility was incomplete. That night the concert would begin differently than planned, and the hall would witness more than a performance. It would witness recognition, not of talent alone, But of dignity long overlooked. The concert began with an energy that felt unfamiliar to everyone present. People settled into their seats, still whispering about what they had witnessed earlier. The woman had returned to the side of the hall, uncertain of her place. Now she kept her hands folded, and her eyes low, afraid that attention might disappear as quickly as it arrived. The pianist sat at the piano. But his posture had changed. He no longer felt like the center of the room. Instead, he felt like part of something larger, something shared. As he played his opening piece, he listened differently, aware of tone, emotion, and space between pieces. His thoughts returned to her. He remembered his own early years filled with ambition and fear of failure. He realized how easily talent could be protected or buried, depending on circumstance. The music he played felt heavier now, as if carrying questions he had never asked himself. During the break, he searched for her among the staff. When he found her, she looked ready to apologize again. Instead, he thanked her. The words felt awkward, but sincere. She nodded, unsure how to respond to gratitude. She was not used to receiving. They spoke briefly away from the crowd. She shared more of her story, not as a confession, but as context. He listened without interrupting. Something he rarely did. He felt the weight of his assumptions settling uncomfortably on his chest. When the second half of the concert began, he made a decision that surprised even him. He invited her to sit near the stage, not to play, but to be present. Some audience members noticed and murmured, but no one objected. There was a quiet understanding that something meaningful was unfolding. As the final piece ended, the applause felt different. It was not only for technique or tradition, it carried gratitude for honesty and connection. The woman clapped softly with the others, still unsure if this moment belonged to her. That night did not change her life instantly, but it opened a door that had long been sealed for the pianist. It marked the beginning of humility for everyone else. It was a reminder that real stories often live just outside the spotlight. The days after the concert moved slowly, but felt different for everyone involved. The woman returned to work, expecting things to go back to normal. She cleaned the halls early in the morning and late at night, just as before, yet people now looked at her with curiosity and quiet respect. Some smiled and nodded, while others seemed unsure how to act. She felt uncomfortable with the attention, because she had learned safety and invisibility. Music had always been private for her, a place where she did not need permission. Now that private world had been seen, and she did not know what it meant. She worried that expectations would rise and then fall, leaving her more exposed than before. The pianist could not stop thinking about that night. He replayed the sound in his mind, not the notes, but the feeling behind them. It followed him into rehearsals and interviews, and even into silence. He realized that for years he had been chasing perfection while avoiding truth. He invited her to meet again, not on stage and not in public. They sat in a quiet room with a small upright piano. He asked her to play again, only if she wanted to. She hesitated, but then placed her hands on the keys. This time the music was softer and more careful, not because of fear, but because the moment felt fragile. He listened without judgment, letting go of comparison. For the first time, he understood that music could be shared without hierarchy. They talked for a long time afterward about choices missed and chances taken, about how life pushes people into corners they never planned for. There was no promise made and no dramatic offer, yet something honest settled between them, a respect built not on status, but on understanding. She left that room still uncertain, but less alone, and he remained seated, knowing he had begun to relearn his own art. Time continued to move forward, carrying quiet changes that were not immediately visible. The woman noticed that she no longer avoided the piano rooms. When cleaning, she moved through them with calm acceptance, rather than longing. Sometimes she paused to straighten a bench or dust the keys more carefully. It felt like caring for something that once cared for her. The pianist began adjusting his schedule to include moments of listening rather than performing. He attended small local recitals and community events where expectations were low. He found himself drawn to sincerity more than reputation. The applause mattered less than the connection forming between sound and listener. They met occasionally in simple settings without ceremony. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they sat in silence. When music appeared, it was natural and unforced. There was no audience and no pressure to prove anything. She spoke openly about her fears of stepping forward again, not fear of failure, but fear of hope. She had rebuilt her life around stability and did not know where music now belonged. He did not push her or offer solutions. Instead, he shared his own doubts, how success had narrowed his view rather than expanded it, how he often felt trapped by the image people expected from him. In her honesty, he found relief. One afternoon, she played a small piece she had written years ago. It was unfinished, but full of warmth and resilience. He listened with care and said it deserved to exist, not on a stage necessarily, but in the world. That simple acknowledgement stayed with her. It was not praise or opportunity, it was permission. And with that permission, something inside her began to open again. The change did not arrive suddenly, but grew slowly through ordinary days. She began to play at home again in the evenings after work. The piano was old and slightly out of tune, but it welcomed her hands. She did not play to remember the past, she played to understand who she was now. The music sounded different than before. It carried patience instead of urgency. There was less ambition and more honesty. She noticed that her body felt lighter afterward, as if something heavy had been set down at the concert hall. The pianist watched her from a distance. He did not interfere or announce anything. He wanted her choice to remain her own. This restraint was new for him, and not always comfortable. He found himself changing as well. He practiced less with force and more with attention. He allowed mistakes to guide him instead of punish him. His performances became quieter, but more present. Others around them noticed the shift. Musicians spoke of a different energy in rehearsals. Staff members felt more included and seen. The hall itself seemed warmer, as if holding shared respect. One evening, she stayed late after finishing her tasks. The building was empty, and silent she sat at the piano again without fear. Her playing filled the space, not loudly but fully. She realized then that music had never belonged to status or stages, it belonged to the act of listening. And for the first time in many years she listened to herself without doubt. The opportunity arrived quietly without announcement or pressure. A small community event was being planned in the same hall. It was informal and open to everyone who worked there. Music was optional, and no one was expected to perform. Someone mentioned her name gently as a suggestion. She felt her chest tighten, and her first instinct was to refuse. The old fear returned, reminding her how easily moments could turn into judgments. She asked for time, and was given it without question. That night she barely slept. Memories and possibilities moved through her mind together. She thought about the silence she had lived with, and the sound she had rediscovered. By morning she understood that fear no longer protected her, it only kept her small. She agreed to play one piece, not to impress, and not to explain herself, only to share something honest. The pianist supported her decision without offering advice. On the day of the event, the hall felt different. There were no formal clothes, and no fixed seats. People talked freely and laughed. The atmosphere was warm and human. When she sat at the piano, her hands felt steady. She looked out and saw familiar faces, not expectations. She began to play, and the room settled into attention. The music carried calm strength and quiet confidence. She finished without rushing. The silence that followed felt complete. Applause rose naturally without force. She stood and smiled, knowing she had chosen this moment for herself. Nothing dramatic happened after, no contracts and no promises. But something lasting had changed. She no longer waited for permission to exist. Through music, the days after the community event felt grounded and steady. She returned to her routine, but with a sense of alignment she had not known before. Music was no longer a secret she carried alone. It was a quiet companion that walked beside her rather than behind her. People did not treat her like a discovery or a symbol. They treated her like someone they understood a little better. Conversations felt easier and more natural. She felt seen without being placed on display. The pianist reflected deeply on what he had witnessed. He recognized that influence did not always come from leading. Sometimes it came from stepping back and allowing space. This understanding reshaped how he approached every collaboration. He began mentoring younger musicians with a different tone. He spoke less about competition and more about listening. He encouraged them to notice people outside their circles. The lessons felt truer and more lasting. She and the pianist continued to share music in simple ways. Sometimes they exchanged ideas, and sometimes they simply listened. There was no expectation of progress or outcome. The absence of pressure allowed growth to happen naturally. She started composing again, not with ambition, but with curiosity. Her pieces reflected ordinary moments, quiet strength and lived emotion. They were shaped by work, by loss, by resilience. Each note felt grounded in real experience. One evening, she realized she no longer defined herself by what she had lost. She defined herself by what she carried forward. Music was no longer a reminder of regret. It had become a language of acceptance. This chapter of her life did not close others, it integrated them. And in doing so, she found balance between who she had been and who she was becoming. The momentum that followed was gentle and steady rather than dramatic. Life did not transform into something unrecognizable. Instead, it became clearer and more intentional. She was invited occasionally to play at small gatherings, not as a feature, but as a participant. She accepted some and declined others, trusting her own sense of balance. Music no longer felt like something she had to protect or prove. It was simply part of how she moved through the world. The pianist noticed how her confidence showed itself quietly, not through bold claims or public attention, but through the ease with which she made choices. He respected that more than applause. Their conversations deepened, but never rushed. They spoke about aging dreams and changing definitions of success. They acknowledged that talent alone did not shape a life. Circumstance, timing, and support mattered just as much. At the hall, new faces arrived, and old routines shifted. The story of that night became something people mentioned without exaggeration. It served as a reminder rather than a legend, a reminder to look more closely at those around them. She remained grounded in her work, cleaning the same spaces with the same care. But now each task felt connected rather than separate. The hall no longer felt like a place she passed through. She felt ownership not of the building, but of her presence within it. Music had given her that, not status and not recognition, but a sense of belonging that did not depend on approval. As seasons changed, she felt no urgency to define what came next. She trusted that listening had guided her this far, and that it would continue to do so, one honest moment at a time. The story did not end with applause or recognition, it ended with continuity. She continued to live her life with the same responsibility and care, but with deeper alignment. Music stayed with her not as a goal, but as a steady presence that supported her sense of self. She understood now that worth was not granted by stages or titles. It was carried quietly through commitment and honesty. Each time she sat at a piano, she felt grounded rather than exposed. The fear that once controlled her choices no longer held power. The pianist carried the experience forward in his own way. His performances grew more restrained, yet more meaningful. He no longer chased admiration, he chased clarity and connection. Their paths crossed from time to time without ceremony. They shared brief conversations and mutual respect. Neither needed more than that. What had passed between them had already done its work. The concert hall remained what it always had been, a place of sound, memory, and movement. But within it, something subtle had shifted. People listened more carefully and assumed less. Her life did not become extraordinary in the public sense. It became authentic. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent. She knew when to play and when to listen. In the end, the true change was simple. She reclaimed a part of herself without needing permission, and that quiet reclaiming became the most lasting music of all.